Welcome, fellow horror hounds, and welcome to the latest episode of Talk and Stalk, your unholy home for horror. I'm your host, as always, Barry, and today's podcast is really just going to be me talking about and ranking my top 5 horror movies from 1982. Obviously, recently I've covered 1980 as well as 1981. Again, this has been pretty difficult to do. 1982 certainly churned out some great horror movies. So there's going to be a few honourable mentions. As always, it's my personal list. I've not seen every horror movie from 1982, so I can only judge this on the films I've actually seen. But there are going to be some honourable mentions that were very, very close to getting into the top 5. But as I said, this was pretty difficult to do. I kind of knew what 2 or 3 films were going to be within the top 3, but as for the last 2 positions, it was pretty tough. So the honourable mentions now are Halloween 3: Season of the Witch, which I'll admit, I like this film. Admittedly, it's very much the black sheep of the Halloween franchise. It's a film, certainly when it was released, I think it threw a lot of people off. It confused a lot of people being called Halloween 3. Everyone's like, where's Michael Myers? But I think this is a pretty good standalone horror film. It's a film that stands on its own 2 legs. And it's just good to see that this film does actually have a fan base. It does have a bit of a cult following and that. So Halloween 3's at Basket Case, which I'll admit is kind of one of my favourite B movies. I have a soft spot for this film. The Entity, which is a very disturbing movie. Now, admittedly, this film could have probably got in the top 5, but it's been such a long time since I've seen this movie. Now, maybe if I watched it now, it would certainly have a chance of getting in the top 5. I don't know, but it's been so long, I can't really make an accurate judgment on this film. But from what I understand, from what I recall, it was a good movie that was actually pretty disturbing, for the base of, also based on the fact that it's actually based on real events. There's also a slasher movie that I've heard good things about called Visiting Hours, starring Michael Ironside. I haven't actually seen it, I'm ashamed to say. So, I can't actually put that in the list. There's also a guilty pleasure of mine, Pieces. By no means top 5 or anything like that, but I think it deserves a mention. It's one of them kind of trashy, bad films that I'll admit I enjoy. I really enjoy Pieces for what it is. So getting into the top 5 now. At the 5th spot is Alone in the Dark. Directed by Jack Sholder, who of course also directed Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge and the Hidden. Alone in the Dark is a slasher movie that I covered quite recently on a podcast. This is a film that deserves more attention. I think among ardent horror fans, it does have a fan base. It is well revered, but it doesn't really get talked about a huge amount. I think this film actually has one of the greatest casts in the history of slasher movies. You've got Donald Pleasence, Jack Palance, and Martin Landau all in one movie. And this film doesn't actually focus on just one killer. It focuses on 4 killers. So it's not your archetypal slasher movie. It is kind of part slasher, part home invasion film, but it's a really good film. It needs a Blu-ray release. I've said this before. It doesn't actually have a Blu-ray release, and I believe it's actually quite hard to get hold of on DVD now. But Alone in the Dark makes great use of its cast. As I said, it's a very different kind of slasher movie. It's one of them slasher movies that kind of stands out from the crowd. That's in the 5th spot. The 4th spot is a very popular horror film. I really do like it. I probably don't love it as much as maybe some people. Poltergeist, of course, directed by Tobe Hooper. It could actually be said that, it's obvious that Steven Spielberg had much creative input on this movie. There are rumors going around that basically Steven Spielberg directed the film. That's a podcast in itself. Poltergeist, I just think, is a good, fun, kind of a roller coaster ride of a horror movie. It's one of them rare horror films as well, where nobody dies. It's kind of a, if you could say somewhat family-friendly horror film. Because there are actually some moments that are quite creepy. The clown in particular, I think the clown scene is a definite highlight for anyone that's scared of clowns. manages to be an effectively scary scene. Obviously, the corpses coming out in the swimming pool, the tree coming to life. Zelda Rubinstein is great in it. She has one of the most distinctive voices, I think, in the history of cinema. I think Poltergeist is a perfectly good horror film. It's not a film that I would say is outright scary. As I said, it's just kind of like a haunt. It's kind of a thrill ride of horror movies. It's kind of an enjoyable experience, I find, with this movie. I think it was clearly inspired by an episode of The Twilight Zone, as I've mentioned many times before, probably my all-time favourite TV series. There was an episode called Little Girl Lost that I think clearly inspired this movie. So Poltergeist is in the 4th spot for me. Now, in the 3rd spot is actually one of my favourite Dario Argento films. I'd probably rate this film a little higher than probably a lot of other people, I don't know. To me, it's one of his best, and that is Tenebrae. Now, there's going to be people out there that are surprised that I'm putting this as high. As I said, there were some films kind of jostling to kind of etching to get into the top 5 here. If you ask me in a few months' time, the ordering may be a little different, but at this point in time, Tenebrae is the film that's going into the 3rd spot. I actually think this is a great giallo. It's got a fantastic score courtesy of Goblin, who also did scores, obviously, on Deep Red and Suspiria. I absolutely love their music. It's a great mystery. It has some effective set pieces. As I said, to me, this is one of Argento's best films. It was released in 82, obviously, when the golden age of giallo was pretty much kind of done and dusted. We were still getting giallos released, but the golden age was very much over. And Tenebrae, to me, is probably the best giallo of the 80s, or certainly one of the best. I just think it's a great mystery. There's twists and turns, and as I said, some effective set pieces. I love how Argento makes great use of, with great use of camera work. Tenebrae. It's probably my 3rd favourite Argento movie. Now, in 2nd place, I think a lot of people are expecting this to be in my top 5. Everyone that knows me knows I'm a huge fan of anthologies, whether it's TV or film, and this is Creepshow. Creepshow is a great anthology. It's one of my personal favourites of all time. I just love how this film is very much in the spirit and tradition of the classic EC horror comics of the 50s, which, this movie is essentially a love letter to. Directed by George A. Romero, written by Stephen King. This film just has a lot of fun. It's 5 short stories. I think all 5 of the short stories are actually good to very good. There's nothing groundbreaking in terms of the stories themselves. It's just very much in the tradition of them classic EC horror comics, moralistic tales and that, if you will. I think it's a great anthology. I really do. I think Creepshow 2 is actually quite good. Not as good as the first, but I still think it has 3, kind of average to good segments. But the first Creepshow, what a cast. Tom Atkins, Adrienne Barbeau, Hal Holbrook, Leslie Nielsen, Ted Danson, there's even Ed Harris. If you want to see Ed Harris doing some dance moves, watch this film. Creepshow, to me, is one of my favourite anthology films of all time, and it's a film that really kind of encapsulates the 80s as well. Now, in the top spot, this is going to come as no shock whatsoever to people that know me, is 1982's The Thing. Of course, 82. This is a podcast about 82. The Thing, just a classic, a great sci-fi horror movie. I love the sense of isolation in this movie. I love the sense of claustrophobia, who to trust. It's obviously loosely adapted on Who Goes There, the classic novel from the 30s. Fantastic practical effects that even hold up tremendously well now, courtesy of Rob Bottin, who actually did some great work for The Howling the previous year as well. This is one of Carpenter's best films, in my opinion. And, it's arguable as to whether this is a remake or not. The original was a classic sci-fi horror film from the 50s. maybe not a remake per se, because it's another kind of iteration and adaptation of the source material. But if classed as a remake, which many people do, this is one of the greatest horror movie remakes of all time. As I said, I love it. A very kind of Agatha Christie-esque aesthetic to this movie. You know, who to trust, who to turn to. As I said, the creature in this movie that takes on many iterations during the course of the film, the practical effects are just fantastic. And as I said, I just love the isolation. And I actually really like the ending to this film as well. There's a great kind of ambiguity, the ending, because we don't actually know. You know, there's this kind of air of mystery to the ending of this film. And it's actually probably one of my favorite 80s horror films, full stop. So yeah, 1982's The Thing, my favorite horror movie of that year. I'm just trying to think if there's actually other honorable mentions. There's Cat People, released in 82, which I actually think is a pretty good remake. It's incredibly erotic. The original is a classic 40s horror film. You know, and just trying to think of any other 82 horror films off the top of my head. There was Madman, which I believe was 82, 81, 82. I think Madman's a good slasher film that certainly deserves a mention. But yeah, and House on Sorority Row, actually. Probably one of my personal favourite slasher movies of the era. Again, not in my top 5, but a very good slasher movie that is very often criminally overlooked, in my opinion. It's one that really doesn't get talked about too much. So that's my list, and let me know what your favourites are. Let me know if you disagree with any or agree with any. We've all got our own opinions at the end of the day, and as I've said a million times before, if we all like the same thing, the world would be a boring place. I think when people have different views and things, it makes for an interesting cause for debate. So that's it for today. Thanks a lot to everyone that listened, and I will be back again soon to haunt you and torment you. Take care.